In the occupied territories, he did not have administrative control over the Waffen-SS units in France, nor of the paratroops or anti-aircraft units that belonged to the Luftwaffe. The fragmentation of command reached ridiculous proportions. For example, the naval coastal guns along the Channel would remain under naval control as the Allied fleets approached the coast. However, the moment Allied troops began to land, command of the coastal batteries would revert to the Wehrmacht. It was bad enough for Rommel. It was never clear whether he or Rundstedt would control the battle. Worst of all, Hitler wanted to command himself. Hitler kept control of the panzer divisions in his hands. They could be committed to battle only on his orders, and his headquarters was 1,000 kilometers from the scene. These were the divisions Rommel was depending on for a first-day counterattack. It was madness. Eisenhower had no such problems. His command was clear-cut and absolute. Initially, he had not been given command of the Allied bomber forces, US 8th Air Force and British Bomber Command, but when he threatened to resign if not allowed to use the bombers as he saw fit, the CCS gave him what he wanted. Every soldier, every airman, every sailor, every unit in the United Kingdom in the spring of 1944 took orders from Eisenhower. Thus did the democracies put the lie to the Nazi claim that democracies are inherently inefficient and dictatorships inherently efficient. Thanks to the clear-cut command authority, a single-minded clarity of purpose pervaded Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, in contrast to the situation at OB West and Army Group B. A factor in creating unity at SHAEF was Eisenhower's relationship with his immediate subordinates, which contrasted sharply with Rommel's command structure. Eisenhower had worked with most of his team in the Mediterranean and had played a role in the selection of most of the Army Corps and division commanders, while Rommel hardly knew the generals commanding his armies, corps, and divisions. This is not to say that Eisenhower liked or even wanted all his subordinates. He did not like General Montgomery and feared that he would be too cautious in battle, but Eisenhower knew that Monty, Britain's only hero thus far in the war, absolutely had to have a major role, so he was determined to work as effectively with Monty as possible, as he had done in the Mediterranean. He thought the tactical air commander, Air Vice Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, too cautious and pessimistic, but was determined to get the most out of him. He liked and admired his deputy, Air Marshal Tedder, enormously, as well as the Naval Commander-in-Chief, ADM Bertram Ramsay. Eisenhower had worked closely and well with Tedder and Ramsay in the Mediterranean. His principal American ground commander, General Omar N. Bradley, was a West Point classmate, an old and close friend, a man whose judgment Eisenhower trusted implicitly. His Chief of Staff, General Walter B. Smith, had been with him since mid-1942. Eisenhower characterized Smith as the perfect Chief of Staff, a crutch to a one-legged man. "I wish I had a dozen like him," Eisenhower told a friend. "If I did, I would simply buy a fishing rod and write home every week about my wonderful accomplishments in winning the war." Rommel had never worked with his army commanders, General Hans von Salmuth of the 15th and General Friedrich Dollmann of the 7th. With Salmuth, he would have shouting arguments. Dollmann had little field experience, was in poor health, and did not much like Rommel. Neither Salmuth nor Dollmann was an ardent Nazi. General Baron Leo Geyer von Schweppenburg commanded the Panzer Group in the west. A veteran of the Eastern Front, Schweppenburg was horrified at Rommel's proposal to use the tanks close up. In his view, that was to misuse the tanks as fixed artillery. Their controversy was never resolved, but it hardly mattered as Rommel did not command the Panzer Group. Rommel fired his first Chief of Staff. The successor was General Hans Speidel, a Swabian from the Werburg district who had fought with Rommel in World War I and had served with him in the 1920s. Speidel was an active plotter against Hitler, more politically adroit and aware than his chief. Eventually he was able to persuade Rommel to support the conspiracy against Hitler, which was growing through the early months of 1944. Here was a profound difference between Rommel and Eisenhower. Eisenhower believed with all his heart in the cause he was fighting for. To him, the invasion was a crusade designed to end the Nazi occupation of Europe and destroy the scourge of Nazism forever. He hated the Nazis and all they represented. Although a patriot, Rommel was no Nazi. Even though at times he had been a toady to Hitler, to Rommel the coming battle would be fought against an enemy he never hated and indeed respected. He approached that battle with professional competence rather than the zeal of a crusader. In mid-March 1943, shortly after the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and nearly 2 months before the final victory in Tunisia, the CCS appointed British Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan to the post of Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander-Designate and charged him with coordinating and driving forward the plans for cross-channel operations this year and next year. Within a month, the CCS decided that no such operation could be mounted in 1943. The final directive, issued in late April, ordered Morgan to begin planning for a full-scale assault against the continent in 1944 as early as possible. It would be hard to imagine a broader directive. Where? Could be anywhere between Holland and Brest. As early as possible could be any time between March and September 1944. Morgan put together a staff of British and American officers with Major General Ray Barker of the U.S. Army as his deputy. They called the group KAC after the initial letters of his title and went to work. KAC operated under one particularly severe constraint. The number of landing craft allotted to the operation limited the planners to a 3-division assault, coupled with the presumption that the Germans were certain to improve the Atlantic Wall. That limitation removed all temptation to plan for widely dispersed attacks. From the first, KAC committed the Allies to the principle of concentration of force. There would be one invasion site, with the divisions landing side by side. The site had to be within range of Allied fighter planes based in the United Kingdom. There had to be at least one major port close at hand that could be taken from the land side and put into operation as soon as possible. There was no thought of landing where the Atlantic Wall was complete, that is, around the French ports. The disastrous deep raid by the Canadians in August 1942 convinced KAC that a direct frontal assault against a well-defended port could not succeed. Therefore, the beaches selected had to be suitable for prolonged unloading operations directly from the LSTs and have exits for vehicles and adequate road networks behind them for rapid, massive deployment inland. Those were tactical requirements. Most of them could be met easily on the French Mediterranean coast or in Brittany, but the strategic requirement was to land as close to the ultimate objective, the Rhineland region, as possible. For the obvious reason that the farther away from the objective the landing took place, the greater the distance to be covered and the longer the supply line. Holland and Belgium had excellent ports, but they were too close to Germany and the Luftwaffe bases. The area inland was too easily flooded and too well defended. The Pas-de-Calais coast in northernmost France was ideal in every way but one. It was the obvious place to come ashore, and thus it was there that the Germans had built the strongest part of the Atlantic Wall. Le Havre in Upper Normandy, on the north bank of the mouth of the Seine, was an excellent port but had numerous disadvantages. To take it, the Allies would have to land on both sides of the river. The two forces could not be mutually supporting, which would allow the Germans to defeat them in detail. East of Le Havre, the coastline is dominated by cliffs with only a few small beaches that had even fewer exits. With Brest as its main port and with smaller but good ports along its north coast, Brittany had advantages, but they were overshadowed by the distance from the United Kingdom and from the objective. Cherbourg was closer to both, which made the Cotentin Peninsula tempting. However, the west coast of the Cotentin was open to storms coming in off the Atlantic and was guarded by the German-held Channel Islands of Guernsey and Jersey. The east coast of the Cotentin was low-lying ground, easily flooded. Further, the narrow base of the Cotentin would make it relatively easy for the Germans to seal off the beachhead. A process of elimination brought the choice down to the Calvados coast of Normandy. The port of Caen, although small, could be captured quickly, probably in the initial assault. There was an airfield just outside Caen called Carpiquet that could be captured by airborne assault on the first day. The capture of Caen would cut the railroad and highway from Paris to Cherbourg, thus simultaneously isolating the Cotentin Peninsula and putting the invaders in a position to threaten Paris. There were other advantages. The mouth of the Orne River was the boundary between the Wehrmacht's 15th Army to the northeast and 7th Army to the southwest, and boundaries between armies are inherently areas of weakness. The attack would come against the 7th Army, which had only one. The Panzer Division, from the 21st to the 15th Army, was approximately 150 kilometres from the major southern British ports of Southampton and Portsmouth. The Cotentin Peninsula protected it from the worst effects of Atlantic storms. From the mouth of the Orne River westward, there were 30 kilometres of open sand beaches, with only a gradual rise inland. There was a good road network inland from Araman westward for another 10 kilometres. The bluffs were almost vertical, but beginning at Seville, the bluffs receded from the coastline for a 10 kilometres stretch. Although the bluff behind was as much as 40 to 50 metres high, it was not vertical, and the beach was open, sandy, and 200 or so metres wide at low tide, 10 metres at high tide. There were 4 draws with roads running down to that beach, making for suitable exits. The British had collected an enormous amount of intelligence on the French coast. Shortly after Dunkirk, the BBC broadcast an appeal for postcards gathered over the years from families who had taken pre-war vacations in France. 30,000 postcards arrived in the first post, and eventually 10 million pictures were collected throughout 1942 and 1943. Aerial reconnaissance photographs were gathered and compiled into panoramic photos. The French resistance supplied information on beach obstacles, strongpoints, enemy units and the like. Information on tides, currents and topography could be extracted from old guidebooks. So a great deal was known about the Calvados coast, but a key question remained. Would the beaches west of the mouth of the Orne River support DUKWs, tanks, bulldozers and trucks? There was concern that they would not. British geographers and geologists reported considerable erosion of the coastline over the past 2 centuries. The original port at Calvados, the old Roman port, had been 2 kilometres out from the 20th century shoreline. French resistance members managed to smuggle 4 volumes of geological maps out of Paris, one in Latin done by the Romans, who had surveyed their entire empire for a report on fuel sources. The survey indicated that the Romans had gathered peat from extensive reserves on the Calvados coast. If there were boggy peat fields under a thin layer of sand on the current coast, they would not support tanks and trucks. To find out, the Combined Operations Pilotage and Beach Reconnaissance Party, consisting of Major Logan Scott Bowden and Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith, set off on New Year's Eve 1943 in a submarine to take samples. They figured the Germans would be celebrating that night. Lieutenant Colonel Nigel Wilmot of Combined Operations was in command, accompanied by a submarine skipper and an engineer. Major Scott Bowden and Sergeant Ogden Smith swam ashore carrying pistols, daggers, wrist compasses, watches, waterproof flashlights, and a dozen 12-inch tubes. They arrived on a rising tide at the seaside village of Luc-Somare on the beach, later given the code name Sword. They could hear singing from the German garrison. They crawled ashore, walked inland a bit, went flat when the beam from the lighthouse swept over the beach, and then walked some more. They made sure to stay below the high water mark so that their tracks would be wiped out by the tide before morning. They stuck their tubes into the sand, gathering samples and noting each location on underwater writing tablets they wore on their arms. Trouble began when they had filled their tubes. The breakers were quite heavy, and they were positively bogged down with all their equipment. They attempted to get out to sea but were flung back. They took a breather, tried again, and were flung back a second time. They then went as far out in the water as they could, watching the rhythm of the breakers until they could time it. On the third attempt, they managed to get out, but they got separated a bit. They swam vigorously to avoid being pitched back in, and although they didn't quite lose contact, Ogden Smith started yelling. Major Scott Bowden initially thought Ogden Smith had a cramp, but when he got close, Ogden Smith was simply wishing him a happy new year. The samples showed that the sand could bear the necessary weight. The Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, COPs, conducted a series of reconnaissance missions all along the Calvados coast that winter. At beaches named Juno and Gold, they sometimes set the submarine on the sea bottom at periscope depth to take bearings and photographs. Major Scott Bowden explained that they could see things not visible from air photographs since they were looking from a worm's eye view. It was a tricky operation because any inadvertent movement in a submarine, while bottomed at periscope height on a wavy beach, could upset the trim and alter the submarine's position. On one occasion, the submarine passed right underneath a French fishing trawler, with a German spotter in the bow. Scott Bowden observed workmen on the beach using two-wheeled carts pulled by horses. He and Ogden Smith made other swims, including one at the beach between Scilly and Ville, codenamed Omaha, and conducted other reconnaissance missions. At the end of January, Scott Bowden was called to Combined Operations Headquarters at Norfolk House, St. James's Square, which had been taken over by Schaeff to report to Admiral Ramsay, General Bradley, General Smith, 4 other generals, and 5 more admirals. Rear Admiral George Cray, Ramsay's chief of staff, drew the curtains and said, "Now describe your reconnaissance." Scott Bowden looked at the map and thought it was too big. "Well, I'm afraid, sir, it's going to be very difficult to give much detail from this." Cray replied, "We've got another map down the other end. It might be better." Major Scott Bowden followed him across the large room, looked at the map hanging there, and indicated it would do. Cray called out, "Come on, chaps, bring your chairs down here." As the generals and admirals picked up their chairs and came over, the 23-year-old Scott Bowden thought, "Oh dear, I'm getting off to a bad start." He stumbled through his account, and then they started shooting questions for nearly an hour. The Navy was not very interested in his comments, but General Bradley was. He wanted to know if Sherman tanks could go up this track or that track. Scott Bowden thought of the two-wheeled carts and said it must be possible. When the brass ran out of questions, Scott Bowden offered an opinion. "If you don't mind my saying so, sir," he told Bradley, "I think that your beach, with all these tremendous implements, with guns deflating the beaches from here and there, is going to be a very tough proposition indeed." Bradley patted Scott Bowden on the shoulder and said, "Yes, I know, my boy, I know." When Eisenhower and his team arrived in London to take over from CAC, they studied Morgan's plan and accepted his logic, except for one major disagreement. Everyone involved, Montgomery, Eisenhower, Smith, Bradley, and others, insisted that the invasion front had to be widened to a 5-division assault. They demanded and received an allotment of additional landing craft. Extending the assault to the east toward La Havre was deemed inadvisable because it would bring the assaulting troops directly under the La Havre coastal guns, among the most formidable on the Atlantic Wall. Morgan had ruled out an extension to the west on the southeast corner of the Yunnan Peninsula because the Germans were flooding the hinterland there. Eisenhower overruled Morgan, deciding to extend to the west. He planned to deal with the problem of flooded areas behind the coastline by dropping the American airborne divisions inland and assigning them the task of seizing the raised roads that crossed the flooded areas, so the seaborne assault troops could use the roads to move inland. The U.S. 4th Infantry Division would lead the way on the Cotentin Peninsula, where the beach was codenamed Utah. The U.S. 29th and 1st Infantry Divisions would land at Omaha Beach on the Calvados coast. The British and Canadians would land on the beaches stretching westward from the mouth of the Orne, codenamed from east to west. Sword, British 3rd Division plus British and French commandos, Juno, Canadian 3rd Division, and Gold, British 50th. The British 6th Airborne would land between the Orne and Dives rivers to protect the left flank. CAC had been tempted to use only one army, either British or American, for the initial assault, which would simplify matters and eliminate the inherent weakness of any Allied line, the boundary between the forces of the two nationalities. However, it was politically impossible. As General Barker had stated in July 1943, it was an absolute certainty that the Prime Minister would not allow the assault to be made solely by American troops, and the same was true for the U.S. government. The invasion was thus settled, The Calvados coast would be attacked with the British on the left and the Americans at Omaha, with an extension to the right onto the Cotentin coast at Utah. The great disadvantage of the Calvados coast was that landing there would place the Allied armies southwest of the Seine River, putting the major river barriers of the Seine and the Somme between them and their objective. However, disadvantages could be turned into advantages. CAC believed that the bridges over the Seine could be destroyed in pre-invasion bombardments, making it difficult for the Germans to bring panzer divisions from the Paris area across the river and into the battle. The greatest advantages of the Calvados coast were the potential for surprise and the possibility that the Germans might be fooled into believing the landing was a feint designed to draw their armour away from Paris to the west of the Seine. The basic reason for the surprise was that by landing at Calvados, the Allies would be moving south from England, away from the area the Germans absolutely had to defend, rather than east from England on a direct line toward their objective. It might also be possible to persuade the Germans on an ongoing post-invasion basis that Calvados was a feint by mounting a dummy operation aimed at Paris. CAC recognized that they could not reverse the process. If the Allies landed at Paris and mounted a dummy operation aimed at Calvados, it would not be believable. The Germans would not keep troops in Lower Normandy for fear of being cut off. Instead, they would bring their forces from Lower Normandy to Paris. However, they might be persuaded to keep troops in the Paris area following a landing on the Calvados coast, as the men and tanks in Paris would still stand between the Allied forces and Germany. In short, geography would help pin down the German armour in Paris and reinforce the German need to keep their panzer armies northeast of the Seine. CAC proposed, and Eisenhower, after taking command, mounted an elaborate deception plan codenamed Fortitude. The objectives were to fool Hitler and his generals into thinking that the attack was coming where it was not, and into believing that the real invasion was a feint. Each objective required convincing the Germans that the Allied invasion force was about twice as powerful as it actually was. Fortitude was a joint venture with British and American teams working together. It made full use of the double-cross system, ultra-intelligence, dummy armies, fake radio traffic, and elaborate security precautions. Fortitude had many elements designed to make the Germans think the attack might come on the Biscay coast, or in the Marseille region, or even in the Balkans. The most important parts were Fortitude North, which set up Norway as a target, the site of Hitler's U-boat bases essential to his only remaining offensive operations, and thus an area he was extremely sensitive about, and Fortitude South, with Paris as the target. To get the Germans to look toward Norway, the Allies first had to convince them that they had enough resources for a diversion or secondary attack. This was doubly difficult due to the acute shortage of landing craft right up to D-Day. It was touch and go as to whether there would be enough craft to carry 6 divisions ashore at Normandy as planned. Therefore, the Allies had to create fictitious divisions and landing craft on a grand scale. This was done chiefly with the double-cross system, the talents of the American and British movie industries, and radio signals. The British Fourth Army, for example, stationed in Scotland and scheduled to invade Norway in mid-July, existed only on the airwaves. Early in 1944, about 24 overage British officers went to northernmost Scotland, where they spent the next months exchanging radio messages. They filled the air with an exact duplicate of the wireless traffic that accompanies the assembly of a real army, communicating in low-level and thus easily broken cipher. Together, the messages created an impression of corps and division headquarters scattered all across Scotland. Of course, the messages could not state, "We will invade Norway in mid-July." The Germans would never believe such an obvious subterfuge. Instead, they read requests for 1,800 pairs of crampons, 1,800 pairs of ski bindings, or 7 corps requests for demonstrators in the Beer method of climbing rock faces, or 2 corps car company requests for handbooks on engine functioning in low temperatures and high altitudes. There was no 80th Division, no 7 Corps, no 2 Corps car company, but the Germans did not know that, and they would come to their own conclusions about what was going on in Scotland. Fooling the Germans was not easy. They were experts at radio deception. At the beginning of 1942, they had mounted one of the more elaborate and successful deception operations of World War II, Operation Kreml. Its objective had been to make the Red Army think that the main German offensive for 1942 would take place on the Moscow front, not at Stalingrad. As historian Earl Ziemke writes, Kreml was a paper operation, an out-and-out deception, but it had the substance to make it a masterpiece of that highly speculative form of military art. The Germans used radio traffic to manufacture dummy armies that supposedly threatened Moscow. In most of its essentials, Kreml was similar to Fortitude. Thanks to the double-cross system, however, the Allies had one advantage over Kreml. The turned German spies in the United Kingdom, whose reliability had been proven to the AB over the past 3 years, were put to work. They sent encoded radio messages to the AB in Hamburg describing heavy train traffic in Scotland, new division patches seen on the streets of Edinburgh, and rumours among the troops about going to Norway. Additionally, wooden twin-engine bombers began to appear on Scottish airfields, and British commandos made some raids on the coast of Norway, pinpointing radar sites, picking up soil samples, and generally trying to look like a pre-invasion force. The payoff was spectacular. By late spring, Hitler had 13 army divisions in Norway, along with 990,000 naval and 60,000 Luftwaffe personnel. These were hardly high-quality troops, but still they could have filled in the trenches along the Atlantic Wall in France. In late May, Rommel persuaded Hitler to move 5 infantry divisions from Norway to France. They had started to load up and move out when the AB passed on to Hitler another set of intercepted messages about the threat to Norway. Hitler cancelled the movement order. To paraphrase Churchill, "Never in the history of warfare have so many been immobilized by so few." Fortitude South was larger and more elaborate. It was based on the 1st US Army Group, FUSAG, stationed in and around Dover and threatening the Paris area. It included radio traffic and inadequately camouflaged dummy units, landing craft in the ports of Ramsgate and Hastings, fields full of papier-mâché and rubber tanks, and the full use of the double-cross system. The spies reported intense activity around Dover, including construction, troop movements, increased train traffic and the like. They said that the phony oil dock at Dover, built by stagehands from the film industry, was open and operating. The capstone to Fortitude South was Eisenhower's selection of Lieutenant General George S. Patton to command FUSAG. The Germans thought Patton was the best commander in the Allied camp and expected him to lead the assault. Eisenhower, who was saving Patton for the exploitation phase of the coming campaign, used Patton's reputation and visibility to strengthen Fortitude South. The spies reported his arrival in England and his movements, as did the British papers available to the Germans in a day or two via Portugal and Spain. Additionally, German agents in Dublin had the London papers the day they were printed and could send on hot items by radio. FUSAG radio signals told the Germans of Patton's comings and goings and showed that he had taken a firm grip on his new command. FUSAG contained real as well as notional divisions, corps and armies. The FUSAG order of battle included the US Third Army, which was real but still mostly in the States, the British Fourth Army, which was imaginary, and the Canadian First Army, which was real and based in England. There were, in addition, supposedly 50 follow-up divisions in the United States, organized as the US 14th Army, which was notional, awaiting shipment to the P-Cal. After FUSAG established its beachhead, many of the divisions in the 14th Army were real and were actually assigned to Bradley's US First Army in southwest England. Fortitude's success was measured by the German estimate of Allied strength. By the end of May, the Germans believed that the Allied force included 89 divisions, when in fact the number was 47. They thought the Allies had sufficient landing craft to bring 20 divisions ashore in the first wave, when they would be lucky to manage 6. Partly because they credited the Allies with so much strength, and partly because it made good military sense, the Germans believed that the real invasion would be preceded or followed by diversionary attacks and feints. It was more important for the Germans not to know that Calvados was the site than for them to think that the Pas-de-Calais was. The success or failure of coming operations depends upon whether the enemy can obtain advanced information of an accurate nature, Eisenhower declared in a February 23, 1944 memorandum. To ensure security, the Allies went to great lengths. In February, Eisenhower asked Churchill to ban all visitor traffic to the coastal areas in southern England, where the base for the attack was being built and where training exercises were underway, for fear that there might be a discovered spy among the visitors. Churchill said he could not go so far in upsetting people's lives. General Morgan growled that Churchill's response was all politics, and warned that if they failed, there wouldn't be any more politics. Still, the British government would not act, but when Montgomery said he wanted visitors banned from his training areas, Eisenhower sent an eloquent plea to the War Cabinet. He warned that it would weigh heavily on their consciences if they were to feed in later years that by neglecting any security precaution, they had compromised the success of these vital operations or needlessly squandered men's lives. Churchill gave in. Visitors were banned. Eisenhower also persuaded a reluctant War Cabinet to impose a ban on privileged diplomatic communications from the United Kingdom. Eisenhower said he regarded the diplomatic pouches as the gravest risk to the security of operations and the lives of their sailors, soldiers, and airmen. When the government imposed the ban on April 17th, it did not apply to the United States or the Soviet Union. Foreign governments protested vigorously, which gave Hitler a useful clue to the timing of overlord. He remarked in early May that the English had taken measures that they could sustain for only 6 to 8 weeks. With the British government cooperating so admirably, Eisenhower could not do less. In April, Major General Henry Miller, Chief Supply Officer of the U.S. 9th Air Force and a West Point classmate of Eisenhower, went to a cocktail party at Clar's Hotel. He began talking freely, complaining about his difficulties in getting supplies, but adding that his problems would end after D-Day, which he declared would be before June 15th. When challenged on the date, he offered to take bets. Eisenhower learned of the indiscretion the next morning and acted immediately. He ordered Miller reduced to his permanent rank of colonel and sent him back to the States, the ultimate disgrace for a career soldier. Miller protested, but Eisenhower insisted, and back he went. Miller retired shortly thereafter. There was another flap in May when a U.S. Navy officer got drunk at a party and revealed details of impending operations, including areas, lift strength, and dates. Eisenhower wrote to Marshall, "I get so angry at the occurrence of such needless and additional hazards that I could cheerfully shoot the offender myself. This, following so closely upon the Miller case, is almost enough to give one the shakes." That officer, too, was sent back to the States to check on how well fortitude and security were working. SHA relied on ultra-intercepts. Each week, the British Joint Intelligence Committee issued a summary of German appreciation of Allied intentions in the West, 1 or 2 page overviews of where, when, and in what strength the Germans expected the attack. Week after week, the summaries gave SHA exactly the news it hoped to receive: that the Germans were anticipating an attack on Norway, diversions in the south of France, Normandy, and the Bay of Biscay, with the main assault with 20 or more divisions against the Pas-de-Calais. The Germans poured more concrete to make more fortifications in the Pas-de-Calais than anywhere else. They stationed more troops there, backed up by the panzer divisions, and concentrated their mines in the channel off the coast of the Pas-de-Calais. They grossly exaggerated the resources available to SHA. They were, in short, badly fooled, but not completely. The mobility the Allies enjoyed, thanks to command of the sea and air, forced the Germans to regard almost any suitable beach as a possible invasion site. At a March 19th conference at Berghof, Hitler put the problem to his senior commanders. Obviously, an Anglo-American invasion in the West is going to come. Just how and where nobody knows, and it isn't possible to speculate. But speculate he did. As the German ability to penetrate fortitude was non-existent, and their ability to penetrate the security measures was limited, a few reconnaissance planes did get through. They spotted the build-up of shipping in the southern ports of Southampton and Portsmouth. But as Hitler pointed out, such intelligence was almost useless. You can't take shipping concentrations at face value for some kind of clue that their choice has fallen on any particular sector of our long Western Front, he said, because such concentrations can always be moved or transferred at any time under cover of bad visibility, and they will obviously be used to dupe us. That did not stop him from guessing. Indeed, he had to guess. The most suitable landing areas, and hence those that were in the most danger, were the two west coast peninsulas of Cherbourg and Brest. They offered very tempting possibilities. It was a bad guess. ADM Theodor Kranke, commanding Navy Group West, guessed that the invasion would come between Boulogne and Cherbourg, either in the Cotentin or at the mouth of the Orne, the mouth of the Seine, or the mouth of the Somme, which was a little better. But as Boulogne to Cherbourg included most of the canal, it hardly pinpointed accuracy. Rommel's guess was the Pas-de-Calais. He spent more of his time there than anywhere else on his long front, inspecting, prodding, and building defences. At the beginning of May, he began to look slightly to the southwest, telling Lieutenant General Gard Fauhin, commanding the crack 116th Panzer Division of the 15th Army, "We expect the invasion on either side of the Somme estuary." But all the evidence available to the Germans continued to indicate the Pas-de-Calais. The pattern of Allied air activity, for example, reinforced fortitude. There were twice as many Allied reconnaissance flights over the 15th Army's sector as there were over other armies. There were almost 10 times as many air raids on targets northeast of the Seine as in Lower Normandy. So Rommel continued to look to the Pas-de-Calais. He was confident that if the Allies invaded there, he could defeat the assault. On April 27th, German Schnellboote, abbreviated E-boats and called E-boats by the Allies for enemy boats, penetrated an Allied shipping concentration for a practice exercise codenamed Tiger and sank 2 LSTs. For the Allies, the loss of more than 700 men was a major blow. The information that the Allies were practicing at Slapton Sands on the south coast of England was potentially useful. Hitler saw this at once. Although he had never been to England or to the Cotentin or Calvados, he had the most amazing ability to store topographical information in his mind. In this instance, he noticed the similarity between Slapton Sands and the Cotentin beach, which was why the Allies were carrying out practice exercises at Slapton Sands. He began to insist strongly on the need to reinforce the defence in Lower Normandy. Within the severe limits in which the Wehrmacht in the west was required to operate, this was done. On May 29th, the weekly Allied intelligence summary included a chilling sentence. The recent trend of movement of German land forces towards the Cherbourg area tends to support the view that the Cherbourg area is regarded as a likely and perhaps even the main point of assault. Had the Germans penetrated the secret of Overlord, only the event would tell. Meanwhile, the good news was that the main panzer forces remained northeast of the Seine with the 15th Army. When Morgan's directive declared as soon as possible, march was out. Even if the Allies got a couple of good days to cross and land, the probability of a spring storm smashing against the Calvados coast during the establishment and building up phase made March too risky. April 1st, the target date suggested by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, was no good because of uncertain and unpredictable Channel weather, and because the spring thaw in Russia would make it impossible for the Red Army to launch a coordinated offensive. Morgan therefore picked May 1st. When Eisenhower took command, he moved the target date back to June 1st in order to have the use of an extra month's production of LSTs, LCVPs, and other landing craft. The target date meant the Allies would go on the first suitable day after June 1st. A number of requirements went into the selection of D-Day, the chief of which concerned tides and moon conditions. The admirals wanted to cross the Channel in daylight to avoid confusion, control the thousands of craft involved, and maximize the effectiveness of the fire support. The Air Force generals wanted daylight before the first waves went ashore in order to maximize the effectiveness of their bombing runs. Both had to give way to the Army generals' insistence on crossing at night to preserve surprise up to the last minute and landing right after first light in order to have a full day to get established. Rommel anticipated that the attack would come at high tide, as that would give the first waves the shortest open beach to cross. But that only showed how little he knew about amphibious operations. From the beginning, the Allies were determined to land on a rising tide so that the landing craft could run right onto the beach and then float free on the rise. The Allies needed at least a half moon on the night of the crossing, enough to provide some illumination for the fleet and for the paratroopers who would be dropping into France some 5 hours before H-hour. A rising tide at first light, following a night with a suitable moon, occurred during 2 periods in June, the 5th, 6th and 7th, and again on the 19th and 20th. Eisenhower picked June 5th for D-Day. The southeast coast of the Cotentin and the Calvados coast of Lower Normandy would be the place, June 5th would be the date, H-hour would be dawn. Rommel had no inkling that the Allies suffered from a shortage of landing craft. He thought just the opposite. Further, the double-cross spies were feeding him false information. His guess as to the date, therefore, was badly off. In April, he thought it would come in the 1st or 3rd week of May. On May 6th, he wrote his wife Lucy, "I'm looking forward with the utmost confidence to the battle. It may be on May 15th, it may not be until the end of the month." On May 15th, he wrote Lucy, "Mid-May already and still nothing doing. I think it's going to be a few more weeks yet." On June 1st, he consulted moon and tide tables and declared there were no good invasion tides, high tide at dawn in his view, until after June 20th. The next day he wrote Lucy, "There is still no sign that the invasion is imminent." Hitler was no better. He indulged himself in the hope that there never would be an invasion. On April 6th he declared, "I can't help feeling that the whole thing's a shameless charade." More realistically, he went on to complain, "We've no real way of finding out what they're really up to over there. We cannot afford to fail." Eisenhower had said the Allies acted on that basis. There was no contingency planning in a general ground offensive mounted in a specific area over a broad front. World War II attackers had some flexibility in their plans. If the initial assault did not force a breakthrough, follow-up units could be diverted to the flanks or held back to try again another day at another place. Overlord, however, was all or nothing. Hitler and Rommel were absolutely right in assuming that if the Wehrmacht could deny the Allies a foothold, the Allies would not be able to mount another offensive in 1944. The size of the gamble on Overlord concentrated the minds of the men at CHA wonderfully, but it also increased the workload and raised tension to nearly unbearable levels. "If I could give you an exact diary account of the past week," Eisenhower wrote in late January, "you'd get some idea of what a flea on a hot griddle really does." Toward the end of May, he wrote, "I seem to live on a network of high-tension wires." In World War I, the side undertaking an offensive always had to worry about an enemy counter-offensive almost anywhere along the line from the Swiss border to the Channel coast. Adequate forces had to be maintained all along that line. The same was true of the Germans in Western Europe in World War II. CHA had an enormous advantage here. There was no possibility of a German offensive against the United Kingdom, so the Allies were free to concentrate all their resources on the point of attack. Before 1918, when the first bombing squadrons came into being and began initial, although still very small, operations, there was no physical way a World War I attacking force could reach behind enemy lines to disrupt the movement of the enemy's men and supplies to the battle area. It could do so only through feints and deceptions. SHA made full use of feints and deceptions, but in addition, the Allies had 3 means to prevent or at least disrupt the movement of German reserves and reinforcements to the lodgement area, isolating Lower Normandy and turning it into a sort of strategic island. The 3 ways involved the airborne divisions, the French resistance, and the Strategic Air Force. Because they were new and untried, there was great controversy over how to utilize them effectively. But in the end, agreement was reached and the job was done. The initial CC plan had called for using the British 6th Airborne Division in and around Caen to take the city and the airfield at KP. That was a bold plan, too bold for Montgomery, who insisted on using the division in what was essentially a defensive role, dropping it into the area between the Dives and Orne rivers to isolate Sword Beach. Bradley, meanwhile, decided to use the US 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions behind German lines in the center to prevent the Germans from launching local counterattacks against Utah Beach and to seize the exits from that beach so that the 4th Infantry Division could move inland. When General Marshall saw these plans, he was upset. At the beginning of the war, Marshall had held great hopes for the paratroops as a new element in warfare, but his hopes had not been realized. In September 1943, for example, a plan to drop the 82nd Airborne on airfields around Rome had been abandoned at the last minute as too risky, and instead the division had been used for tactical support of the Salerno beachhead. Early in 1944, Marshall told Eisenhower that the failure to use paratroops in a strategic role had been a severe disappointment to him. He thought the Allies could do much more to exploit their command of the air and the elite airborne divisions that had been built at such cost. Marshall felt there had been a lack of conception caused by a piecemeal approach, with each commander grabbing at a piece to assist his particular phase of the operation. If he had been given command of Overlord, Marshall said he would have insisted on a single large airborne operation, even to the extent that, should the British be in opposition, he would carry it out exclusively with American troops. Marshall suggested to Eisenhower that the Allies use the airborne south of Évreux, some 100+ kilometers inland from Caen. There were 4 good airfields near Évreux that could be quickly captured, so the lightly armed airborne troops could be reinforced. "This plan appeals to me," Marshall declared, "because I feel that it is a true vertical envelopment and would create such a strategic threat to the Germans that it would call for a major revision of their defensive plans. It would be a complete surprise, would directly threaten both the crossings of the Seine River and Paris, and would serve as a rallying point for the French resistance." The only drawback Marshall could see was that "we have never done anything like this before, and frankly, that reaction makes me tired." Eisenhower hated to disagree with Marshall, and almost never did so. Thus, his reply was long and defensive. He said that for more than a year, one of his favorite subjects for contemplation had been getting ahead of the enemy in some important method of operation, and the strategic use of airborne troops was an obvious possibility. Nevertheless, on this one, Marshall was wrong. First, Eisenhower told his boss, he had to have the airborne on the flank at Sword and behind German lines at Utah in order to get ashore. Second, and more importantly, an airborne force well inland would not be self-contained, would lack mobility, and would therefore be destroyed. The Germans had shown time and again in the war that they did not fear a strategic threat of envelopment. Using the road nets of Western Europe, they could concentrate immense firepower against an isolated garrison and defeat it in detail. Anzio was an example. An inland airborne force, cut off from all supply except what could be brought in by air, without tanks or trucks, immobile and inadequately armed, would be annihilated. Eisenhower told Marshall that far from being a strategic threat to the Germans, airborne troops at Évreux would just be wasted. "I instinctively dislike ever to uphold the conservative as opposed to the bold," Eisenhower concluded, "but I insisted on using the 6th, 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, as Montgomery and Bradley wanted to use them, to keep German reinforcements away from the invasion beaches." When Eisenhower took command, the Luftwaffe had been driven back into Germany to fight a defensive action, giving the Allies command of the air over France. Britain and America had put a tremendous effort into building their air fleets, including fighters, but most of all, medium and heavy bombers. The expense was staggering. One reason for the shortage of landing craft, for example, was the amount of steel, engines, and production capacity in general that had gone into building bombers. In addition, the air forces got first call on personnel at the expense of the armies, where junior officer and non-com leadership suffered as a result. Building the air armadas, in short, had been a gamble in technology and technique. The armadas gave the Allies command of the air and thousands of planes to exploit it. Those two facts gave the Allies a great asset, unique in the history of war. Was it worth the effort? That was a question no longer worth asking. The asset existed, but it left an outstanding question: how to use it. There was no dispute about how to use it on D-Day. Everyone agreed that just before H-hour and through D-Day, every Allied bomber that could fly would participate in the attack on the Normandy coastal defences. But there was intense dispute over the role of the bombers in the 2 months preceding the invasion. General Carl Spaatz of the U.S. 8th Air Force and Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris of RAF Bomber Command were wedded to the theory that bombers by themselves could win the war. General J.F.M. Whitley, a British officer who had served as Eisenhower's Deputy Chief of Staff in the Mediterranean, had gone to the Churchill-Roosevelt CCS conference in Quebec in September 1943. Whitley reported that there was much discussion in Quebec about Overlord. His impression was that within the RAF and U.S. Army Air Forces, AAF, commanded by General Henry Hap Arnold, there were powerful groups who hoped Overlord would meet with every success, but who were sorry that they could not give direct assistance, because of course they were more than fully occupied with the real war. The important war against Germany was reduced to its essentials. The dispute between the airmen and the ground soldiers was simply put: Spaatz and Harris believed that the further behind the front lines their bombers operated, that is, within Germany itself, attacking strategic targets, the more effective they could be. Eisenhower and the SHA staff believed that the closer to the front lines the bombers operated, that is, within France attacking tactical targets, the more they could contribute to Overlord. There was, in addition, a dispute between the bomber commanders. Although they agreed that Overlord was not really necessary, Harris and Spaatz had their own strategies. Harris felt that RAF Bomber Command could bring about a German capitulation through terror bombing of German cities. Spaatz felt the 8th Air Force could achieve a German surrender through the selective destruction of certain key industries, especially oil and synthetic fuel production facilities. The Army commanders, most of all Eisenhower, believed that the only way to bring about a German surrender was to overrun Germany on the ground. To do so required, first of all, a successful Overlord. They further believed that only air superiority made Overlord feasible. As often happens with the military, the dispute was fought out not over the straightforward question of targeting, but rather over the more complex question of organization and command structure. Here things were well muddled. Although Eisenhower was the supreme commander, he commanded only those forces assigned to him by the CCS, which did not include the 8th Air Force or Bomber Command. The only air power SHA possessed was the British Tactical Air Force and the American Tactical Air Force, 9th Air Force. Under the immediate command of Air Vice Marshal S. Trafford Leigh-Mallory, Leigh-Mallory's experience had been solely with fighters. He was a cautious, pessimistic sort. Harris and Spaatz neither trusted nor liked him. They refused to serve under him or SHA. In January, Eisenhower argued with Marshall and Arnold about command. He insisted that Harris and Spaatz should be under SHA for a period of several weeks before the invasion, so that SHA could pick the targets. He told Arnold he had strong views on the subject. To his surprise and relief, Arnold agreed that the bombers should be placed under his direct command for the impending operations. Eisenhower intended to use the bombers to paralyze the French railway system. He believed it could be done, and that once accomplished, it would hamper German movement of reinforcements to Lower Normandy. The program, called the Transportation Plan, would take time and could not be accomplished with a 2- or 3-day blitz on the eve of Overlord. The Strategic Air Force commanders were offering to participate in an interdiction program that would begin shortly before D-Day and would concentrate on line cutting, strafing, bridge breaking, and the destruction of a few railroad focal points. The transportation plan called for a prolonged attack on rail yards, sidings, stations, sheds, repair shops, roundhouses, turntables, signal systems, switches, locomotives, and rolling stock. The official historian of SHA writes that in getting their proposal adopted, Eisenhower, Tida, and Leigh-Mallory were vigorously opposed on both strategic and political grounds by most of the bomber commanders, by members of the 21 Army Group staff, and by the Prime Minister and most of the War Cabinet. Harris and Spaatz led the protest. Harris argued that Bomber Command, built for night raids and area bombing, could not achieve the accuracy required to hit marshalling yards, repair facilities, bridges, and other pinpoint railroad targets. Tida, the strongest advocate at SHA of the transportation plan, and indeed the man who had convinced Eisenhower of its necessity, even accused Harris of juggling figures to prove that his bombers could not hit the proposed targets. Spaatz insisted that the continuing success of operations against German oil refineries would assure the greatest support for Overlord. He convinced Arnold to change his mind and support him. Spaatz argued that his oil plan would, in the long run, immobilize the Germans much more effectively than the transportation plan. Eisenhower replied that the oil plan would have no immediate effect. The Germans had accumulated stocks of oil and gasoline in France in scattered and camouflaged depots. Only when those supplies were used up, well after D-Day, would a stoppage of oil production affect German military operations in France. Spaatz shrugged off this point by saying that the transportation plan would be only of slight help in isolating the battlefield, while the oil plan would be of major help later. This was the crux of the matter. Spaatz assumed that it would be easy to get ashore and stay there. Eisenhower did not. The oil plan would also allow the Air Force to retain its independence from SHA, a point on which Spaatz insisted because of Lee-Mallory. Eisenhower was embarrassed by Spatz's open hostility to Lee-Mallory and tried to reassure Spaatz that Tida would personally supervise the air campaign. Further, as Spaatz noted in his diary, Eisenhower tried subtly to sell Lee-Mallory, saying that he felt that maybe proper credit had not been given to the man's intelligence. Spaatz told him that his views had not and would not change. Unable to persuade the air commander, Eisenhower turned to his superiors. He convinced Churchill that Tida could act as the aviation lobe of Eisenhower's brain, thus bypassing Lee-Mallory so far as the bombers were concerned. But he could not persuade Churchill on the key point. The Prime Minister ruled that there could be no question of handing over the British Bomber Command as a whole to the Supreme Commander and his deputy. Further, Churchill insisted that SHA's air plans should be subject to CCS approval. Eisenhower objected to submitting his plans to the CCS and demurred at anything short of complete operational control of the whole of Bomber Command and the American strategic forces. He felt so strongly about this that he told Churchill unless he was given command of the bombers, he would simply have to go home. This extreme threat, almost unique in the history of war, evidently never occurred to Rommel to tell Hitler that unless he got control of the panzers, he would go home. The British War Cabinet drew up a directive that gave Eisenhower supervision of the bombers. Marshall suggested the word be changed to command, but the British refused, leaving Eisenhower astonished. On March 22nd, he wrote in his diary, "If a satisfactory answer is not reached, I am going to take drastic action and inform the CCS that unless the matter is settled at once, I will request relief from this command." That same morning, the British chiefs were meeting. When Eisenhower heard the results of their deliberations, he added a postscript to his diary entry. "I was told the word of direction was acceptable. Amen." Tida prepared a list of more than 70 railroad targets in France and Belgium. For the obvious reason that it would give away the invasion site, the bombing could not be concentrated around Lower Normandy. On April 3rd, it went before the War Cabinet for approval. The British had previously forbidden air attacks on occupied countries if there was a risk of high civilian casualties. Now they drew back from the transportation plan for that reason. The argument for concentration on these particular targets was that Churchill wrote to Eisenhower that it was very nicely balanced on military grounds. He added that the cabinet took rather a grave and on the whole an adverse view of the proposal. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden was especially adamant. He pointed out that after the war, Britain would have to live in a Europe that was already looking to Russia more than he would wish. He did not want the French people to regard the British and Americans with hatred. Eisenhower replied that he was convinced the transportation plan was necessary for the success of Overlord, and unless this could be proved to be an erroneous conclusion, he did not see how they could fail to proceed with the program. He reminded Churchill that the French people were slaves and would benefit most from overlord. "We must never forget," Eisenhower added in his strongest argument, "that one of the fundamental factors leading to the decision for undertaking overlord was the conviction that our overpowering air force would make feasible an operation which might otherwise be considered extremely hazardous, if not foolhardy." He said it would be sheer folly to refuse approval to the transportation plan. Churchill put Eisenhower's views before the War Cabinet. He spoke eloquently of Eisenhower's onerous responsibilities, saying care should be taken not to add unnecessary burdens. Still, he complained that he had never realized air power would assume such cruel and remorseless form. The transportation plan, he feared, would smear the good name of the Royal Air Forces across the world. Churchill wanted the French consulted. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Walter B. Smith, then talked to General Pierre-Joseph King, the representative of General Charles de Gaulle's Free French Committee of National Liberation. To Smith's surprise, King reported that he took a much more cold-blooded view than the British did. His remark was, "This is war, and it must be expected that people will be killed. We would take the anticipated loss to be rid of the Germans." Churchill was almost, but not quite, beaten down. He decided to take the issue to Roosevelt, and thus force the Americans to take their share of the responsibility for approval of the plan. He told Roosevelt of the War Cabinet's anxiety about these French slaughters and of the British doubts as to whether almost as good military results could not be produced by other methods. Roosevelt must decide. Roosevelt replied that military considerations must dominate. The transportation plan had won. SHA put the bombers to work on the French railway system. By D-Day, the Allies had dropped 76,000 tons of bombs, 76 kilotons, or about 7 times the explosive power of the atomic bomb used against Hiroshima on railway targets. The Seine River bridges west of Paris were virtually destroyed. Based on an index of 100 for January-February 1944, railway traffic dropped from 69 in mid-May to 38 by D-Day. But this was not accomplished exclusively by the bombers. The French resistance played a major role. There was some French resentment, although not as much as Eden feared. Casualties were lighter than the pessimists in the War Cabinet had predicted. On June 3rd, in Weekly Intelligence Summary No. 11, SHA-G2 assessed the results to date. The report began, "The enemy-controlled railway system in the West has undergone and continues to undergo an attack such as no transport system has hitherto experienced, either in intensity or duration. Some 1,700 locomotives and 25,000 wagons had been destroyed or put out of action, which sounded impressive but constituted only 13% and 8% respectively of the pre-raid figures. Worse, the Germans were able to replace rolling stock by taking it from French civilian needs. As the summary noted, the prime sufferers have been the French people. French traffic has invariably been curtailed at the expense of German requirements, and an already greatly strangled French economy has experienced further setbacks. Consequently, the losses were not such that the enemy would be prevented from moving up supplies and reinforcements as required, although such movement would be less efficiently operated. Beyond rolling stock, the transportation plan was directed against depots, turntables, and bridges. Some 58,000 tons of bombs had been dropped on 90 targets, inflicting great damage. Unfortunately, the Germans were adept at repairs. In many cases, the damage was cleared, and the lines reopened within 24 hours, and in many more within 48 hours. More encouraging was the report on railway bridges across the Seine from Paris to the sea. 8 of the 9 had been destroyed. Of the 9 highway bridges attacked, 7 had been destroyed or partially damaged. On the eve of D-Day, SHA-G2's conclusion was ominous. Evidence as to the effect on German troop movements remains unsatisfactory, but the effects till now do not appear to have been very serious. That judgment cast doubts on the wisdom of the transportation plan. The bomber commanders were never convinced that it was wise or effective. After the war, official U.S. Army Air Force historians wrote that long after D-Day, there remained the sobering question as to whether the results of the plan were commensurate with the cost in air effort and the ruin inflicted on French and Belgian cities. However, those in the best position to know, the German generals, were strong in their belief that the various air attacks were ruinous to their counter-offensive plans. The plane that did the most damage was the B-26 Marauder, developed by the Glenn L. Martin Company. A medium bomber, it flew at low altitudes and could be extremely accurate. It was the principal attacker of the railroad bridges and rail yards. After the war, RL's Chief of Staff, Hans Speidel, said the destruction of railways was making regulated railway supply impossible. As early as mid-May 1944, lack of fuel paralysed all movement. The Seine bridges below Paris and the Lai bridges below Oran were destroyed from the air before the 6th of June 1944. Speidel's statement is inscribed on the B-26 memorial at the USAF Air Museum in Dayton, Ohio. In a 1946 interview, General Jodel said that the complete construction of the coastal defences was not yet finished, and never would have been because the necessary sand and cement could no longer be brought up. Gordon Harrison, the official historian of the cross-channel attack, concluded that by D-Day, the transportation system in France was on the point of total collapse. This was to prove critical in the battle for Normandy. There was more involved in the disruption of the transportation system than just the bombers. The French resistance played a part that was perhaps as important and certainly more efficient per pound of explosive. The resistance had grown from practically nothing in the dark days of 1940 to a considerable force by early 1944. Like all successful clandestine operations, its organization was complex and fragmented, divided regionally and politically. Its acknowledged head was Charles de Gaulle, but he was in Algiers, far from the scene and incapable of exercising anything like rigid control. Liaison was provided by the Special Operations Executive, SOE, established by the British in late 1940. The first agents parachuted into France in the spring of 1941, and the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, modelled on SOE, began operating in 1943. The resistance had many significant weaknesses. It was always subject to German penetration, inadequately armed, and in many cases totally unarmed. Lines of authority tended to be unclear, communication within units was poor, and communication between units was almost non-existent. It was distrusted by the bulk of the population, as most French people wanted no trouble with the Germans and feared the consequences of stirring them up. The resistance had assets, including bravery, a willingness to make personal sacrifices for the goal of liberation, and fierce patriotism. Most of all, it was behind enemy lines and could provide intelligence of the most accurate kind. Sabotaging rail lines, bridges, and similar infrastructure could provide an underground army in the German rear areas that might delay the movement of German forces toward the battle. Regarding intelligence gathering, the resistance was the best possible source on the Atlantic Wall, because most of that wall was built by Frenchmen. Monsieur Clément Marie of Porton-Bessin in Calvados was one of many who, in June 1942, was forced by the Germans to work on the construction of a major fortress at Pointe du Hoc, just west of what came to be called Omaha Beach. There was no heavy equipment. Everything was done by shovel, handcart, horsepower, and manpower. The fortifications were dug 23 feet deep into the ground. All the works, tunnels, trenches, and so on were covered. Bunkers above soil level were also covered with topsoil and sod. Marie helped to pile earth on the sides of the bunkers so that it gently sloped from the top to natural ground level. Marie also worked at Pointe de la Percée, the western edge of Omaha, building radar sites for the German Kriegsmarine, Navy. He recalled a time in early 1944 when it was announced that Rommel was coming to inspect. The Germans gave the French workers an order to wear their caps. When Field Marshal Rommel appeared, the word was spread quickly, and when Rommel arrived, there was not a single man in Porton-Bessin wearing a cap or hat, thus no obligation to salute. Naturally, Rommel did not notice such a small act of defiance. The Germans needed more workers to make up for the absence of heavy equipment. In many ways, the Atlantic Wall was constructed in exactly the same way as the Great Wall of China, by human labour. The big difference was that the Germans used concrete and steel reinforcing rods. Rommel told a division near Le Havre to pay the French farmers well and promptly for their help in erecting obstacles, pointing out that the enemy is least likely to invade where the most obstacles have been erected. The French farmers were only too glad to line their purses. Naturally, the Germans never paid enough. They established an exchange rate between the mark and the franc that was ruinous to the French and did not feed the workers well enough to win their loyalty. As a result, the workers complained and grumbled, and some passed information along to active resistance figures. The Special Operations Executive, SOE, had many ingenious ways of getting information back to London, including the use of carrier pigeons dropped from airplanes. André Rouyrong, a resistance member in Normandy, described this curious blending of ancient communication methods with modern technology. He received a visit from Ernest Gaisson, who was very happy to have found a carrier pigeon that had been parachuted into his pasture. The pigeons were dropped at night in a cage attached to a small parachute. They were found the next morning by the owner of the pasture or orchard. The equipment for this communication was meticulously prepared. A packet of food for the bird, a parchment envelope containing instructions, and 2 moulded tubes for sending messages. The tubes were attached to the ring encircling the pigeon's leg. The system included very thin special paper, a pencil, and instructions on how to feed and return the bird. A questionnaire about the occupying troops, their movements, and defensive works was included. Rouyrong was head of an escape section that rescued many young American pilots and crews shot down over France. He used the pigeons to send messages indicating that the men, last names only, no rank, were safe. He feared that additional information might lead to the pigeon being shot down. The Germans built a gun battery on the cliff just west of Port-en-Bessin, big fortifications with 155 mm guns, beautifully camouflaged with nets and dirt embankments, making them invisible from the air. The farmer on whose land they were built was furious because he could not graze his cattle or grow crops. He measured the distances between the bunkers, the observation post, and other points. He had a blind son, about 8 or 9 years old, who had a fabulous memory. The Germans paid little attention to the boy. One day in early 1944, the boy hitched a ride to Bayeux, where he managed to get in touch with André Heinz, an 18-year-old in the resistance. The boy provided Heinz with the information, which was then sent to England via a homemade radio transmitter hidden in a Campbell soup can, now on display in the Battle of Normandy Museum in Bayeux. Thus, the British Navy on D-Day had the exact coordinates of the bunkers at the village of Bernil on the bank of the KH Canal, where a bridge crossed the waterway. Madame Tertz-Gondry, who ran a café, overheard German conversations since she spoke German, and passed on the information to Madame Villon, head of the local maternity hospital and of the local resistance. Madame Villon forwarded the information to her superiors in the resistance in Caen, who passed it to SOE agents in the area, who got it back to England via radio or small airplane. Major John Howard of the Ox and Bucks 6th Airborne Division, who was training his company for a campaign operation against the bridge on D-Day, knew a great deal about the enemy, including the location of the button that would set off the demolition charge to blow the bridge to prevent capture. The 56th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne had as one of its D-Day objectives the village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Thanks to the resistance, Lieutenant Richard Winters of Company E of the 56th knew, among other things, that the local German commander was seeing the local teacher and took his dog for a walk every day at precisely 1700 hours. Sieur Gomme Mercader of Bayeux owned a bicycle shop and had been a professional bicycle racer before the war. He was able to travel about without difficulty under the pretext of training and gather specific intelligence on defense construction, infrastructure, armaments, troop locations, and beach obstacles. His departmental contact was Miss Meslin, alias C.E.D. Morvin, head of the subdivision. Every week at number 259 Saint-Jean Street in Caen, He met with her to hand over the requested information. Thanks to information gathered and passed on from the French resistance, supplemented and enhanced by ultra-intercepts and aerial reconnaissance, the Allies undoubtedly had better information on enemy dispositions and strength than any attacking force in history. Sabotage was another resistance specialty. In the period 1941 to 43, it consisted of sporadic, uncoordinated pinpricks against war industries, railroads, canals, and telephone and telegraph systems. It was not of such a scale as to cause the Germans much worry. But beginning in early 1944, after SOE came under SHA control, railway sabotage was greatly accelerated and tied into the transportation plan. A resistor with a stick of dynamite who knew where to place it on a bridge could be much more effective than a B-17 dropping a 500-pound bomb from 15,000 feet on the same target. The man on the spot could also time the explosion to take out a locomotive when the bridge went up. In the first 3 months of 1944, the resistance destroyed 888 locomotives compared to 387 damaged by air attacks. After the transportation plan went into effect, the figures were reversed. In April and May, the bombers put 1,437 locomotives out of action, compared to only 292 credited to the resistance. The British hoped for more direct support from the resistance. A committee consisting of representatives from SOE and the Army considered the possibility of a national uprising. The resistance could make a strategic contribution to Overlord if it were backed by a general strike or by a rising on a national scale. However, French officers pointed out that the notion of a mass uprising implied universal courage, whereas courage inspired only a few men. The idea of mass uprisings also implied battling against modern tanks with the stone-throwing catapults of Caesar's time. SHA was more realistic. It wanted to use resistance groups to prepare demolitions to blow main trunk lines leading into the lodgement area beginning on D-Day, known as Plan Vert. By May, SOE was able to report to Shah that 571 railroad targets were ready for demolition. Plan Vert was supplemented by Plan Tortue, a project for blocking enemy road movements through guerrilla action, which involved firing Sten and Bren guns into German columns, and then retreating into the woods, hoping the Germans would follow. Since the Germans were regularly picking up resistance members and torturing them for information, the resistance could not be told in advance about the date of D-Day. Therefore, arrangements had to be made to order the execution of sabotage plans through code messages broadcast over the BBC. Leaders were instructed to listen to BBC broadcasts on the 1st, 2nd, 15th and 16th of each month. If the invasion was imminent, they would hear a preparatory code message and then remain on alert for a confirmatory message. This would be followed within 48 hours by a code launching the units into action. Each region had a different code. In Bayeux, the action code for Miss Mira's unit was, "It is hot in Suez," followed by, "The dice are on the carpet." He recalled hearing these messages over the BBC in Bayeux. In my cellar, the radio was on at 6:30 p.m. The first message said, "It is hot in Suez," twice, then a definite silence, followed by, "The dice are on the carpet," twice, along with other messages that didn't concern us. Stunned by these messages, I was momentarily overwhelmed but quickly recovered. After turning off the radio and climbing the steps from the cellar, I informed my wife of what I had heard. I then took my bicycle to contact my principal responsible people about the imminent landing. The night was going to be long. SHA considered limiting sabotage activity on D-Day to Lower Normandy. A strong argument for this was to wait in other regions until the destruction of bridges would be immediately helpful to the Allies, especially in the south of France, where another landing was scheduled for mid-August. Additionally, if the resistance acted all across France, it would expose its members to identification and capture by the Germans, who would then have time to repair the damage. However, these arguments gave way to the view that it was preferable to create the maximum amount of chaos behind enemy lines at the moment of landing, and SHA figured it would be impossible to keep various resistance groups quiet after the news of D-Day broke. Anthony Brooks, a 20-year-old Englishman who had grown up in French-speaking Switzerland and had been studying in France when the war began, was in 1944 an SOE agent in southern France near Toulouse. He had been receiving airdrops of explosives, which he distributed to his resistance operatives. They hid these explosives in cesspools or even on locomotives. When the drivers were resistance, we would hide the explosives on an electric locomotive, he recalled. No German soldier is going to open up a thing that says 16,000 volts on it and has a key. Some explosives were placed in lavatory water tanks, which could hold up to 20 kilos of explosive. Like most SOE agents, Brooks found that his recruits were impatient and eager for action. We had to let them blow up trains every now and again, even if it was too soon and we had no orders, he said. Occasionally they derailed the wrong train, which led to some bad press. One train they derailed was a Swiss Red Cross train carrying 4 enormous vans full of eggs. People were trying to scoop the yolks out of the river to make omelettes, cursing the resistance the entire time. In April 1944, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, moved into a town near Toulouse named Montauban. It was refitting after hard service on the Eastern Front, receiving brand new Tigers, Germany's biggest and best tanks. The Tigers were gas guzzlers, weighing 63 tons and getting half a mile to the gallon. They were subject to mechanical problems and had only steel tracks, which wore out quickly on highway travel. Therefore, the Germans always moved the Tigers for any distance on railroad cars. The Tigers were concentrated in Montauban and kept under heavy guard. The railway cars they rode on were hidden in village railway sidings around Montauban, each concealed by a couple of worn-out French trucks dumped on top. These transporter cars were unguarded, so Brooks put his sub-agents to work. One of them was a beautiful 16-year-old girl named Tetty, the daughter of the local garage owner. She had long ringlets and was often smacked by her mother for playing with them. Throughout May, Tetty, her boyfriend, her 14-year-old sister, and others would venture out after dark by bicycle to the cars, where they siphoned off all the axle oil and replaced it with an abrasive powder parachuted in by SOE. Brooks told Tetty and the others to discard the oil, but the French found it ludicrous to throw away such high-quality motor oil, which fetched a fine price on the black market. On D-Day, Das Reich received orders to move out for Normandy. The Germans loaded their Tigers onto the railway cars, but every car seized up before they reached Montauban. The damage to the car's axles was so extensive that they could not be repaired. It was a week before the division found alternative cars in Périgueux, 100 kilometers away. The resistance harassed the division from Montauban to Périgueux, causing Das Reich to arrive in Normandy by D+17 instead of by D+3 or 4. Furthermore, as Brooks notes with satisfaction, no train went north of Montauban after the night of June 5th unless it was flying the French flag or the Union Jack. The contributions of the paratroopers on the night before D-Day, the bombers, and the resistance in the weeks before D-Day cannot be appraised with precision. However, it is clear that while Eisenhower never had to worry about his rear, Rommel always did. According to General Eisenhower, before the battle is joined, plans are everything. As Supreme Commander, he directed a planning operation that was infinite in scope, complex almost beyond description, and on which the outcome of the war depended. He insisted on and got an all-out effort from staff officers at SHAEF, down through the 21st Army Group, Montgomery's headquarters, British Second Army, and American First Army, as well as all levels of staff at various Air Force, Navy, and Coast Guard commands. As a result, Overlord was the most thoroughly planned amphibious operation in history. When Eisenhower visited Bradley's headquarters, he told the officers, "This operation is not being planned with any alternatives. This operation is planned as a victory, and that's the way it's going to be. We're going down there and we're throwing everything we have into it, and we're going to make it a success." In a 1964 interview with Walter Cronkite, Eisenhower repeated those words with intensity, showing a reminder of the power of his voice, body posture, attitude, and aura of certainty and command displayed in 1944. Then he visibly relaxed, let a shy grin creep up the corner of his mouth, and added, "But there's nothing certain in war. Unless you can put a battalion against a squad, nothing is certain." The job of the planners was to make certain of as much as possible. To do that, they needed to be in constant touch with troops in the field, monitoring the results of exercises and training maneuvers to decide what would work, what might work, and what wouldn't work. They had to consolidate all that information with input from other services to come up with a comprehensive plan that everyone agreed to. The process started at the top and worked down. Eisenhower decided where and when to deal with objections, such as the idea that adding the Cotentin and Utah Beach would be too costly due to the flooded areas behind the beach. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Smith, suggested using airborne divisions to seize the causeways leading inland over the flooded areas. There was intense opposition from the airborne commanders, but Eisenhower ruled in favor of Smith. By late January, Eisenhower's basic decisions were in place. On February 25th, Bradley's headquarters had an outline plan drawn up, and British Second Army had one completed a month later. The process moved down to corps, division, regiment, and battalion levels. General Freddie Dean and Montgomery's Chief of Staff recalled that along the chain of command, nothing was ever proposed without heated opposition. If corps wanted it, division didn't. If the Army proposed something and the Navy agreed, the Air Force was sure to object. D.W.I. Gand reported that it was Monty's 21st Army Group staff that made the decision to send the DD tanks, the swimming tanks, in on the first wave with naval guns firing over their heads. The reasons for using DD tanks in the van were to achieve an element of surprise, which might be effective in demoralizing the enemy. Additionally, the tanks would provide rallying points for the infantry. At higher levels, the temptation to reach down and solve lower echelons' problems was great, but it was overcome. General Dean explained, "At first we all tried to discover a school solution to the composition of the assault waves, guns, engineers, tanks, infantry, in what order, where, etc. But after the first training rehearsal, we decided the notion of a single formula was nonsense, and we let the particular assault section solve its own problems. Each problem depended on the nature of the defensive works facing the particular corps, division, regiment, or battalion, and even more on Rommel's defensive works. Rommel could not plan, only prepare. Planning made possible a concentration of energy and force, but it required knowledge of where and when that Rommel did not have. Preparation for an attack anywhere required a dispersal of energy and force. On every beach that was remotely suitable for an amphibious landing, Rommel built defences offshore. The Germans' first line of defence consisted of mines anchored in the channel, not enough to satisfy Rommel, but enough to cause a major problem for the Allied navies. On shore, the defences differed to suit local terrain conditions, but the beach obstacles on the tidal flat between the high and low water marks were similar on Omaha, Utah, and the British beaches. The tidal flat obstacles began with so-called Belgian gates, gate-like structures built of iron frames 10 feet high. These sat in belts running parallel to the coastline about 150 metres out from the high water line. Anti-tank mines carrying 12 pounds of TNT were attached to the structures, or old French artillery shells brought in from the Maginot Line, pointed out to sea and primed to fire. Admiral Rouge had no faith in landmines and artillery shells stuck under water as they had no waterproofing, but the marine mines he preferred were not available in sufficient quantity. Next, at about 100 metres out from the high water mark, a band of heavy logs was driven into the water at an angle, pointed seaward, with tell mines lashed to the tips of some of the logs. At about 70 metres from shore, the main belt of obstacles featured hedgehogs, 3 or 4 steel rails cut into 2-metre lengths and welded together at their centres, which could rip out the bottom of any landing craft. Rommel treated France like a colossus. He could and did flood the countryside by damming rivers or letting in the sea. He could and did uproot and evacuate French civilians, tear down vacation homes and buildings to give his artillery a better field of fire, and cut down forests to get the trees he needed for his beach obstacles. The obstacles forced the Allies to choose between risking their landing craft on a full tide or coming in on a rising tide, thus giving the German soldiers an opportunity to cut down the first waves of attackers as they struggled through the tidal flat and up to the first feature of the beach, which at Omaha was a bank of shingle, small smooth rocks, or a line of sand dunes at Utah that could provide some cover. Rommel had his static divisions, many of whose battalions were OST units. In some divisions, the men were 50% Polish or Russian. Right up close at each of the beach exits, at Omaha, for example, riflemen and machine gunners were in fire trenches on the lower part of the bluff, halfway up the bluff, and at the top, scattered along the slopes of the draws and on the plateau above. Hundreds of Tobruk's circular concrete-lined holes were big enough for a mortar team, a machine gun, or even the turret of a tank. The Tobruks were connected by underground tunnels. Beside and around them, the Germans had fixed fortifications of reinforced concrete, looking straight down onto the beach. In these fortifications, as in the Tobruks, there were panoramic sketches of the ground features in front of them, providing range and deflection for specific targets. In other words, they were zeroed in. Back down on Omaha Beach proper, the Germans had 12 strong points built to provide enfilade fire the length of the beach. Big guns, 88 mm and even 105 mm, were placed into casemates with embrasures that opened down the beach, not out to sea. The casemates had an extra wing on the seaward side to hide the muzzle blast from the Allied navies. Up on the bluff, there were 8 concrete casemates and 4 open field positions for 75 mm to 88 mm guns, all sighted for both grazing and plunging fire. Every yard of beach was covered. The guns came from all over the Nazi Empire, French 75s, big Russian guns, 105s from Czechoslovakia, and others from Poland. The big casemates could withstand any shell the Allied navies could throw against them and still protect the guns. To protect the casemates from the real threat of an infantry assault with grenades and flamethrowers, the Germans surrounded them with landmines and barbed wire. The GIs hitting the beach in the first wave at Omaha would have to get through the minefields in the channel without their last blowing up, then get from ship to shore in a Higgins boat taking fire from inland batteries. They then had to navigate through an obstacle-studded tidal flat of about 150 metres, crisscrossed by machine gun and rifle fire, with big shells whistling by and mortars exploding all around, to find their first protection behind the shingle. There they would be caught in a triple crossfire: machine guns and heavy artillery from the sides, small arms from the front, and mortars coming down from above. If the GI was not killed getting off his landing craft or crossing the tidal flat, if by some miracle he made it to the shingle, Rommel wanted him wounded before he got there, if not paralysed by fear to keep that GI huddled there. Rommel had more mines laid between the shingle and the bluffs. There was a shelf of beach flat, in some places marshy. Rommel relied mainly on mines, irregularly placed throughout the shelf and of all types. Some were simple charges of TNT covered by rock and set off by tripwires. Others were devices of the devil that jumped up when activated and exploded at waist height. Rommel laid 6.5 million mines and wanted many millions more. His goal was 11 million anti-personnel mines. Behind the mines and around the barriers, there were anti-tank ditches about 2 metres deep and cement anti-tank or anti-armour barriers across the exit roads. All this was backed up by big guns. At Point du Hoc, there was to be a 6-gun battery of 155 mm capable of firing into the mass of shipping off both Omaha and Utah beaches. Another was at St. Maru, looking right down on Utah, and another at Long Sault, covering Gold Beach, and so on. Behind Omaha, once one got inland from the plateau, there were no fixed defences of any kind. This mainly reflected the impossibility of Rommel's building a genuine Atlantic wall with depth. The length was too great and the resources insufficient. It partly reflected Rommel's all-or-nothing attitude about the battle for the beaches. But as every GI who fought in Normandy can testify, in the country of hedgerows and stone-walled villages, farmhouses, barns and outbuildings, fixed fortifications were not needed. the hedgerow country of Normandy was ideal for fighting a defensive struggle with the weapons of the mid-20th century. At Gold, Juno and Sword, the beach obstacles were extensive, but the dunes were not so high as at Utah. Instead of bluffs behind the seawall, there were French vacation homes. Some of these were torn down to give a better field of fire, and some were used as strongpoints. There were casemates, large and small, scattered along the coast. As elsewhere, there was no depth to the defence. At Utah, the beach obstacles were in place, but there was no bluff behind the beach, only sand dunes behind the 1 to 3 foot seawall. The extensive trench system manned by infantry was absent, but the Germans had dug into the dunes a series of towbrooks with tank turrets mounted on them, connected by underground trenches, along with casemates holding heavy artillery, thousands of miles of barbed wire, and thousands of mines. The strong point at Utah was a blockhouse at La Madeleine. It had an 88 mm cannon, 250 mm anti-tank guns, 275 mm cannons, a 16-inch howitzer, 5 grenade-launching mortars, 2 flamethrowers, 3 heavy machine guns, 1 under an armoured turret, and 8 Goliaths. These were miniature tanks, hardly bigger than a child's wagon, but they were stuffed with explosives and had a radio guidance mechanism. Behind the dunes at Utah, a road ran parallel to the beach. 4 exit roads, or causeways, as the Americans called them, ran inland perpendicular to the beach. The causeways crossed the flooded fields created by damming up local rivers. Behind the flooded fields, Rommel had troops stationed in every village, along with field artillery positioned on the causeways. The troops came from the 79th and 716th Divisions, consisting of the Georgian Battalion and 642nd OST Battalion. They had almost no organic motor transport. These inland units were used to build defences locally, consisting of sticking logs into the ground in any open field suitable for a glider landing. The Allies had used gliders extensively, though not very successfully, in Sicily in July 1943, and Rommel assumed they would again. To prevent it, he devised Rommel's asparagus, 10-foot logs driven into the ground, topped with shells attached by interconnecting wires. The shells didn't arrive from Paris until after D-Day, but the logs by themselves were enough to bust up a wooden glider travelling faster than 100 kilometers per hour. For deception purposes, Rommel built casemates that held no guns. Admiral Rughead recalled that dummy batteries attracted many Allied air attacks and helped the real guns to survive. The Americans were making extensive use of rubber blow-up tanks and other heavy vehicles as part of Operation Fortitude, but the Germans did not develop such devices. Instead, Rommel poured more concrete and planted more asparagus. Colonel General Gudrun von Sodenstern, commander of the 19th Army in southern France, thought Rommel mad. He commented on Rommel's fixed defences as, "No man in his senses would put his head on an anvil over which the smith's hammer is swung. So no general should mass his troops at the point where the enemy is certain to bring the first powerful blow of his superior material." To which Rommel replied, "Our friends from the east cannot imagine what they're in for here. It's not a matter of fanatical hordes to be driven forward in masses against our line, with no regard for casualties and little recourse to tactical craft. Here we are facing an enemy who applies all his native intelligence to the use of his many technical resources, who spares no expenditure of material, and whose every operation goes its course as though it had been the subject of repeated rehearsal." He was right in his analysis of the American army, but in the view of General Baron Leo Gischberg, he was badly wrong in his conclusion about how to meet the attack. Gischberg commanded Panzer Group West when Rommel began moving the 2nd Panzer Division closer to the coast north of Oman. Gischberg protested, but Rommel insisted and put the leading battle group right on the coast, dug in. He growled to Admiral Rughead, "The Panzer divisions are going to be moved forward whether they like it or not." Shortly thereafter, an angry General Gischberg, accompanied by Hitler's panzer expert General Heinz Garren, confronted Rommel. The latter blandly told them he intended to dig in every tank on the coastline. Garren was shocked and insisted that the very strength of panzer formations lies in their firepower and mobility. He advised Rommel to pull the tanks back out of range of Allied naval guns. Garin insisted that the lesson from the Sicily and Salerno landings was crystal clear. The Germans could not fight a decisive battle while under those naval guns. He knew that an amphibious force is not at its most vulnerable when it is half ashore, half at sea. It is at its most powerful at that time thanks to those big naval guns. He urged Rommel to think in terms of a counter-offensive launched on the enemy's terms at some choke point inland when the enemy was overstretched. That was the way the Russians did it with great success, as Garin could testify. Rommel would not budge. "If you leave the panzer divisions in the rear," he warned, "they will never get forward once the invasion begins. Enemy air power will stop everything from moving." When Garin reported to Hitler, he recommended pulling back and fighting inland, which specifically meant keeping command and control of the panzer divisions out of Rommel's hands. Hitler tried a weak-kneed, half-hearted compromise. On May 7th, he turned over 3 panzer divisions to Rommel, the 21st and 116th. The other 4 panzer divisions were to be held inland. General Alfred Jodl, chief of OKW, assured Rommel that although the 4 divisions were under OKW's control, they would be released for operations without further application by yourself the moment we could be certain about the enemy's intentions and focus of attack.